captured from the air above this and being worked in and dissolved into the water. Dissolved oxygen levels can also vary between day and night because plants produce oxygen during the day through photosynthesis. So we need to take that into account. If we're just monitoring, if we monitor every day, then one day we monitor in the night, we're going to expect to see a drop. Okay. The next thing we're going to look at is biological oxygen demand, or BOD. Okay. It's the measure of the amount of organic material in the water, the amount of organic matter in the water. This could be poo, this could be living things that are dead, this could be soil, this could be any organic matter. The reason this is a measure and this is an environmental indicator is because waste and organic matter is broken down by bacteria, as we talked about before, and oxygen is used in this process. Okay, so the more organic matter, the higher the biological oxygen demand. The more that life, biology, the more that life is demanding oxygen. Okay? The more organic matter, the higher the BOD. So it's an indicator of water cleanliness because the more biological oxygen demand there is, then the more the less oxygen there's going to be. So if you have a biological oxygen demand which is below 1 part per million, that is, we're talking about the amount of organic matter, then that indicates extremely clean water. As it increases to 2 parts per million or more, it indicates that there is organic matter in the water, which can be moderate to severe pollution, depending on how high it gets. The next one we're going to look at is salinity. So salinity is looking at salt. So the way that we measure the salt content of soil, for example, is by looking at the conductivity. It measures the amount of inorganic salt material dissolved in the soil or a water sample. And a conductivity probe in water or soil measures the flow of electricity between the probe's electrodes. The more salt there is, the higher the conductivity. The more electricity, the easier electricity can pass from one probe to another. So there's another way to measure it, but that's okay. We'll just focus on the probe for now. Land clearing for irrigation and agriculture can cause the water table to rise. And I'm going to explain this on the next slide in a bit more detail. If the water table is naturally saline, then it causes the soil and streams to also become more salty or saline. Salinity that has occurred because of human activity is called secondary salinity. So that's important. So if human activity has caused this, then it's called secondary salinity. Natural salinity is called primary salinity. So let's have a look at this in a bit more detail using some images. On the image on the left, you see a natural, happy ecosystem where we get precipitation or rain that falls down, and the roots of the vegetation trap most of this water, and before it flows down into the water table, they trap, they absorb it, the plants use the water, and then the plants transpire this through their leaves and it goes back up into the atmosphere. Okay, so that is how it happens before clearing. Now, after clearing, saline groundwater rises, and the reason is because precipitation or rain falls down, but there's no roots to take this up. You can see there's some pretty shallow-rooted grasses, but they don't suck up much water, and so a lot of water goes into the water table. Okay? The water table rises, and then we get what's called percolation. Percolation is where water kind of seeps up through the ground, comes up. And you can see the deep-rooted trees now are beginning to be affected. So vegetation growth is affected because the deep roots are only sucking up salty water. Now, over time, what is going to happen is all the plants and trees are going to die, especially in this lower area, so in these low areas, and no water is going to get sucked up and transpired, and so all the water will filter into the water table, which is the groundwater. That's going to rise, and you're going to start to see salt and water. Well, salty water will reach the surface, then evaporate, leaving this salty crust on the ground. And this is an absolutely huge issue, and if you go back to the last slide, you can see that in an area where salinity has become a big issue in Western Australia and parts of Victoria, they're planting lots of salt-tolerant species which are able to suck up the salty water and evaporate it to try and lower that water table, and that's really the only thing that you can do is try to lower the water table. Alright, so another environmental indicator after salinity is to look at the nutrient levels in the stream, so the phosphorus and nitrogen. They're the nutrients. So phosphorus is needed by organisms for their metabolism and growth, and plant and animal cells depend on phosphorus. It makes DNA, it makes a whole range of other things. Nitrogen is essential for the production of protein, so we need phosphorus and nitrogen for all the cell stuff that cells do. Natural sources include decomposing living things and soil runoff, but really, especially in Australia, we don't have much phosphorus and nitrogen is very limited. So that's why fertilizers can have a big impact on Australian ecosystems. Our human activities increase both of these things, and this can lead to algae and water plants choking the waterways. Okay, algae and water plants choking the waterways. Eutrophication is what ensues. So this is the process where we have heaps of nutrients, and the algae and the plants grow and then die. So the plants grow, then die, and then the plants have to be broken down by bacteria, and those bacteria, obviously that increases the biological oxygen demand, reducing the dissolved oxygen, and effectively eliminating the dissolved oxygen, meaning that no other species can exist. So let me just run through that one more time. The increase in nutrients increases algae and plant growth. They grow heaps, so there's lots of plant and algae, and then they die, those plants and algae. Once the nutrients are used, essentially, the plants and algae die. The dead plants and algae are now organic material, and we said before that an increase in organic material leads to an increase in bacteria, which demand oxygen, and an increase in biological oxygen demand reduces the dissolved oxygen, which means that there's no oxygen left for living things. So, if we're detecting high levels of phosphorus and nitrogen, then that's a precursor to eutrophication. So that makes these excellent environmental indicators. If we're monitoring phosphorus and nitrogen, then we can hopefully prevent eutrophication because we're monitoring these things. The last one we're going to look at is temperature. So temperature of a water body is affected by the depth of the water, the flow rate, the surrounding vegetation cover, the time of day and the season, and the turbidity as well. The reason that turbidity affects the temperature is because when soil particles absorb heat from the sun, so we've got soil particles, they absorb the heat from the sun, that heats the water where these particles are at the top of the water column, and it means no sunlight or heat can go below that. So the lower part's going to be very, very cold. Water temperature decreases here. This is known as thermal stratification, and the cold water sinks and the hot water rises, and there's no mixing. It stays the same. This can be pretty detrimental to a lot of things. Humans can influence water temperature in a range of ways. So if we're discharging water from reservoirs, so maybe the pipe from a reservoir that flows into a river is at the bottom of the reservoir where it's very cold, instead of normally the top water would flow down a river. So if we build dams, sometimes that can change the temperature of the water in the river below it. If we clear vegetation that shades the water body, so if we take away the side vegetation, then suddenly the sun can warm up the water. Warm water runoff from hot roads and concrete areas, industrial waste, and then we talked about the turbidity already. So a few things here. If we increase the temperature, the concentration of dissolved oxygen decreases. So increasing temperature reduces dissolved oxygen. So that's important to know. The temperature also influences the rate of photosynthesis. So as temperature increases, photosynthesis speeds up and plants grow very quickly. And we just talked about in the last slide that when plants grow very, very quickly, then the oxygen is used, then the plants die, then they're decomposed and the oxygen is used up. So sometimes an increase in temperature acts just like an increase in nutrients. Okay? Leads to the plants dying, decomposing, oxygen used up,